Welcome everybody this evening to our first in a post-pandemic policy mini-series. I'm really pleased to welcome our panellists this evening. We have Latika Bourke, who is a journalist and author, writes for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and has worked in Australian broadcasting. I also welcome Alicia Kearns, MP for Rutland and Melton, who has made Melton Marlborough pies very popular in the House of Commons on the shores, and also Professor Kerry, who is Professor of Chinese Studies and the Director of the Lao China Institute at King's College. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and welcome.
Hi.
So tonight we are exploring the UK's future relationship with China, very topical at the moment, given the coronavirus epidemic has got a lot of people talking about what that should look like in the future. And I'd really like to just get your general thoughts on what you think that's going to look like moving forward, and what big issues and topics and questions are going to come up in the future. Alicia, could we start off with you, please?
Sure. So when I was having a think, when you asked about what our future relationship with China would be, I was trying to think about what is China. And I think that's something that many of us in the UK need to improve our understanding of. I think it's quite interesting when we talk about China, people either talk about it in a very hawkish manner or in a very dove-like manner. And actually that's not a good way to go forward. You know, to my mind, China is a young superpower. It's an economic partner, it's a production superhouse, but it's also an authoritarian regime. It has a very muscular foreign policy, and it also commits human rights atrocities at home. But that's very modern. You know, the UK has a relationship of, I think over 200 years of trading with China, and we need a really pragmatic and clear-eyed relationship with China. And to be productive, we need to be able to cooperate, and we need to be able to work together. But we can't whitewash or compromise on those values that we believe should be universal. And I think the current risk for UK-Chinese relationships is that we don't slip into a state of permanent hostilities. And I think there's a real risk of that, and we absolutely can't do that. But we also can't determine the relationship on our own. It's a two-way street. So China has to be willing to be a meaningful and fair partner. So it needs to not try to silence the UK when it criticises authoritarian initiatives or efforts. And we have a duty as a good partner to stand by them and to work with them, but also to speak out and challenge them where they are committing atrocities and not standing by people. So I think as the UK, it's that balance that we need to strike that we haven't yet found our way towards, of balancing the kind of security, economic and geopolitical risks that China definitely presents, and then working with our allies, which I think is a key bit of this, to build a constructive relationship with China, where there is a better kind of respect of human rights, where the Chinese people have a freer way of life, but ultimately where we can trade with them, work with them, do academic partnerships together in a more productive way. So I don't necessarily have the answer of what the future of relations should be, but I think we need to find our way there, and we're very lost at the moment.
Thank you, Alicia. Professor Brown, could I ask you to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've been dealing, with China for nearly 30 years now, and I suppose it's always been a bit of a mystery. What do British people think of China? I mean, although I'm British, I've always sort of found it a bit puzzling, kind of go around. I lived in Australia towards China a bit better, and I guess we can see it in America too. And Britain has always been, sort of, I think, a bit complacent about China over. But I think, as Alicia just said, it's sort of, well, we've obviously woken up to China, but we seem to be waking up the wrong side in this, potentially very, very negative view of China. There's much complexity about what China is, that's true. And I think, in going around China a lot and sort of talking to different people there, I don't know. I mean, it's not a sort of simple story. I think, I guess the thing that I sort of really want to say at the beginning is I really wonder, I'm really skeptical about whether there's much mileage in talking about human rights with China. I think they've sort of lost interest in that dialogue. And I've been engaged in that, for nearly 2 decades, one form or another. And I kind of think we need to maybe concentrate more on what we want from China We need to know that we're dealing not with a proselytizing kind of country. I don't think they're at all interested in promoting their sort of political values here. I think they're kind of interested in talking about things that matter to them, like Taiwan and South and East China Sea. But I don't think that we're dealing with like the USSR, you know, kind of quite a proselytizing entity. I guess the final thing I'd sort of say is, you know, despite what people say and people think, the perception that China is a big actor here is just not true. I think it's less than 2% of investment, and it's also quite a small trade. I mean, it's I think our 6th or 7th trading partner, depending on how you calculate it. It's not present in our lives in the way that it is, you know, maybe in America and certainly in Australia and New Zealand. And I mean, I guess that sort of, you know, creates this quandary that the UK is in, that if we're going to leave the EU, you know, common market at the end of the year, either with or without a deal, if the United States is tanking its economy, it looks like it's really taking a big hit. Our economy is obviously going to be in a really, really difficult situation. I don't know what other options there are except to look seriously at the world's 2nd biggest economy. I mean, that's got to be important. And we don't do much with it at the moment. We could only do more with it, really. And we've invested a lot in doing more with it without ever really doing it. So I think we shouldn't close our options off at the moment with too much of this sort of, you know, deep hostility towards China. Yes, there's big, big problems, but for our own self-interest, I think we've got to deal with it.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. And Latika, please, could I ask you to share your thoughts?
Seena, yes, and it's Latika. Don't
Sorry.
worry, it's fine. So thanks for having me. It's good to talk about the Australian experience in the UK because I arrived here in 2016 and the conversation here has just been dominated by Brexit. And it seems that there is zero bandwidth for the UK to talk about China, for the public to have a bit of a debate about what it wants out of China and vice versa. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus has accelerated that conversation in a way you were probably never expecting. And I don't think you could have hoped to expect that for 10 years. But I think it's brought into sharp focus some of the lessons that Australia has learned. Now, we're obviously much geographically closer. Our economies are completely linked. China is our biggest two-way trading partner. There is absolutely no suggestion that if we were to take a hostile stance against China, there is no suggestion that we would, because of course, economic decoupling for Australia would be a tragedy for Australians. It would mean the end of our prosperity. And until this year, before the pandemic, Australia was looking at 30 years uninterrupted economic growth. Now that is a lot to do with China. In fact, it's all to do with China. So Australians have a very different understanding about China. We know that they are our top economic partner, but we also know that they are a strategic and security threat. And that has really changed over the last, say, 5 years. I would say in 2007, when there was a change of government from a Conservative to a Labor government, that Labor Prime Minister at the time, who won, Kevin Rudd, spoke Mandarin. And this was seen as a great change in Australia's fortunes, that we would have a Mandarin-speaking Prime Minister who would be able to go to Beijing and talk Chinese with the Chinese. Now, since that kind of heyday, a lot has changed. Australia has banned Huawei, of course, from the National Broadband Network. That happened way back in 2009 under that Prime Minister, and then from 5G 2 years ago. To come here and see Britain struggling with this question of whether you would let Huawei into your 5G is almost mind-blowing in Australia. So there's a lot of differences. I would say you are far, far behind where we've had the conversation. But the benefit of that is that you are starting out from a position where you're not as closely tied economically. You're not at this stage as economically dependent on China. As we saw with the PPE crisis, if you do outsource too many of your supply chains to the one person, and that one person doesn't play by the same rules and doesn't share your cultural values and will use a crisis against you, you're in a very risky situation. And so I think that the future China relationship is almost going to be dictated by the public if the politicians don't act first and work out a smart strategy.
Thank you. And I suppose that takes us nicely on to our first point, which is what does trade with China in the future look like? And there's a clear warning there about not becoming too closely linked with China, but we're in an economy that is becoming increasingly linked with China's economy. We rely on them, as you quite rightly said, for manufacturing many of our products. We rely on them to provide us with technology that, quite frankly, we've not invested in the research over here for, and we very much need those components within our mobile phones, for example. Is it inevitable that trade with China will grow, and is that right? I ask anyone to step in.
Well, I mean, well, as I said, it's not huge at the moment. So you'd assume, especially in the current circumstances, that would increase. I mean, the problem is in the past, the sort of things that the UK was very strong at, services and broadly, it wasn't easy to get access to China. China didn't have a big market for that. I guess you could say the change now really is that there's possibly 300 million, maybe, 500 million emerging middle class in China who are potentially a source, they're the world's greatest economic asset, basically. And I think they're going to be crucial in getting out of this colossal mess that we're in now. I mean, the problem was China, I guess, and the solution is China. So that's the quandary. So I guess strategically, because I'm assuming that the Chinese economy is going to have as colossal a problem as everyone else's economy, that it is not a bad time to strategically talk about a kind of free trade agreement, because historically, China has usually made concessions when it is under this kind of pressure, and it doesn't often make concessions. The other good thing, I suppose, is that others, like Australia, have done free trade agreements. There's much that we could learn from what they've done. I mean, the Australian-China free trade agreement is quite limited. There's many people who believe it hasn't given what was expected, but there's a lot of knowledge to go on. And I guess the final thing is the US-China trade negotiations and the trade war has revealed a lot about what China gives a priority to. So we do have a lot of knowledge about the kinds of things and the kinds of ways that we can work with China. But at the moment, Britain does not do a lot. So my assumption is that it's very likely we'll do more.
I think I'd agree with a lot of that. And I think absolutely we want a good trading relationship with China. It just can't be, we have to be cognizant that it can't be a good trading relationship at any cost. And I think we absolutely don't want dependencies. And I think the crisis, as Latika said, has brought that to a whole. We don't want dependency in any way, because it's a point of national security that you don't want to be dependent too much on one nation. It is interesting. I think Australia has managed to balance very well, having an incredibly strong trading relationship with China, but it also calls China out on human rights abuses. And that's an incredibly difficult line to follow, because China tries never to segregate the two. We won't trade with you if you call us out on human rights abuses. We will cause you problems if you criticize us. We've seen it today. Australia's been calling for they're one of the loudest advocates for an international investigation into COVID-19 and what happened in Wuhan. And today, China has announced tariff threats, potential suspensions of Australian agricultural goods, that could really cripple Australia's economy. And so you see that they cannot separate the two, and they're not willing to. But actually, it's also not a one-way street. Although China is the mass producer and a young economic power, financial services, they really rely on us in terms of currency and bond trading. The first RMB bond was was released in London. Financial services are a big issue. So I think we have a lot more to stand on our own 2 feet for when it comes to the UK than many people would think. Even though China is this mass producer, we have to recognise what we can bring to the table in terms of those trade relationships. And it definitely isn't that one is stronger than the other.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess what I'd really like to understand as well is that China have a different economic model within their country. They heavily subsidise a lot of their exports, and it renders it completely uncompetitive to go and produce those things in this country and in many others. We are very much a democratic and capitalist country, and we don't heavily subsidise our exports in the same way that they do. Is there a fear that if we continue to buy their heavily subsidised exports, that we will become reliant on those particular products to the detriment of, well, we're going to lose value for money because they can put their prices up because we're not producing it and we can't get it anywhere else?
But that's the point you could have made 15 years ago. I mean, I have to say from experience, we're always and this isn't just Britain. I mean, it's everyone. We're always 5 years, 10 years too late with these things. You know, I mean, if we didn't want to kind of be dependent on some of the supply chain issues that we're experiencing now, we could have done like Japan did in the late 2000s and diversified. I mean, but we didn't, and so and nor did America, and nor did others. So I guess we're just a bit too late to do that. But actually, the other side, of course, is that labour costs have gone up significantly in China. It is no longer, and I don't think the Chinese government particularly wants to be a sort of big manufacturer in some ways. It also wants to get into these high-tech areas. So I mean, for Huawei and things like that, it's a different issue. For standard manufacturing, I think China is pretty happy for people to also look elsewhere in some ways, because it doesn't get what it used to get from that.
And I would add to that, Seena, manufacturing only comes to the fore when it's something like PPE or during a pandemic where you need a lot of stuff en masse quickly that you don't have capacity to scale up as quickly as somebody who already has those plants to do. I think the answer for the West is to get smart. So the great thing China did was work out what industries would dominate the 20th century. So Huawei technology is a great example of this. And it has created a market where it is essentially the top player. And the other two competitors are almost nowhere to be seen on the field. So the West has to get smart and think about, well, what are the next sectors? What is the future? Where are we headed? So there's quantum computing, there's encryption, there's AI, there's robotics, there's lots of spaces where the West can carve its own future. And I think the big problem that I have with the way that I think some people seem to accept the dominance of China as this young superpower, which is a great way to put it, is that it is a fait accompli, that we are forever beholden to their economic might. So therefore, it's a natural follow that we'll also have to be obedient to all the things that they want on human rights, on Taiwan, on the South China Sea. Well, I think what we've shown in Australia is that you can actually stage some sort of democratic pushback. It has huge support from the public, and crucially, it has bipartisan support. And I think that's the other big missing factor in the UK. I think I've barely heard the Labor Party mention China. And I think that if the Tories really want to get serious about carving out an economic strategy that sets this nation up well in terms of prosperity and national security, it would start to reach across the aisle and form some of this. And you have a much more sensible opposition in place now. So that should be able to happen.
I agree with Latika. I think it's really interesting that China, we have to get much smarter in this country about focusing on what China wants and what drives it. And ultimately, there's a lot of people sit there going, what are China's aspirations abroad? What countries they're trying to compete with? It's all about the domestic. It's all about the Chinese Communist Party, its survival. Xi, I imagine, would still like to be in power when they reach their 100th anniversary in, I think, is it 2049? It is all about power consolidation, absolute certainty control. But as Latika said, they focused on what was going to be the next thing, and they moved from manufacturing to high tech. And that is now what they want to own. And the issue is that, as you said, they have a state-run economy, and they participate in a high level of economic espionage, a high level of kind of government support for their businesses. And the fact is that all Chinese businesses have to give intelligence to the Chinese state if they request it. So we need to work to get China to achieve market economy status. And we absolutely have to push back, as Latika said. It's not about just saying, well, China's this and China's that, and we're just going to have to cope with it. It is our duty to try and challenge it.
The other thing I would say, Seena, is you've got to be on guard that China, and we see this with Russia as well, these authoritarian states will use liberalism against itself. They will use the institutions of our free society against us. So in Australia, for example, we see the Chinese coming in, they use defamation law to try and silence Australian journalists for reporting on them. And we've had this time and time again, including journalists at my own newspaper who have been taken to court. And we have very awful defamation laws in Australia. That's another question. But they will use these rules against us. And so I think Britain needs to be very, very careful about things like universities. This is a big issue in Australia where the CCP monitors Chinese students on campus. It reports back home. It will threaten students' families back at home if students in Australia start talking about things the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to hear or doesn't want to hear them espousing in public. So I think Australia has shown you absolutely have to be on your guard. And the UK is, I think the great thing they could see from us is learn how to wisen up. I mean, we've almost given you a bit of a template.
And Kerry's absolutely right. It's because we've been asleep at the wheel. We've been too focused on the obvious threats, such as Russia, and we fail to recognise, and it all comes down to hybrid warfare. You know, the state of conflict we're in with other countries and hostile actors and terrorists now is permanent. You know, you don't always know who your enemies are. You don't know how they're operating, why they're operating, who's behind them, the way they're doing it. And the weapons aren't kinetic. They're not airstrikes and so on, although we did see the Chinese sink a Vietnamese ship only, I think, last week in the South Seas. But it's all about, for China, they're about economic warfare. That is how they get the power they need, an economic kind of espionage all the way through to purchasing of land, all the way through to agreements, to controlling workforce, to controlling IP. It's a very different type, and we've been so focused on that Cold War mentality of what is war and what is conflict, that we just haven't been prepared, and we've slept through, and that's a real issue. But again, as I said, we can't slip into the state of permanent hostilities like we have with Russia. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, but we have to be willing to stand up at the same time without allowing that slip. So it's an incredible tightrope to walk, how we balance calling them out, but not ending up in a Cold War of sorts, of having no proper relations.
Brilliant. Professor Brand, have you got anything to add there?
Well, quite a bit. I mean, I think I can understand the sentiment, but I mean, I don't sort of see it so sharply. I mean, I was at the University of Sydney for 3.5 years until 2015, and for all the claims, you know, that Chinese students were sort of under this sort of pressure, to me, the vast majority that I knew were just sort of having a really, really tough life in Australia because they were in communities where they were largely with other Chinese. They didn't really kind of it was much more sort of, you know, humdrum issues in a way, but it was still pretty significant. And I kind of think no one, you know, forced anyone to sort of do that in Australia. It just happened. And yet there was sort of quite a lot of criticism, you know, of Chinese students all kind of running these spy rings. I'm sure, you know, in technology areas, yeah, that was sort of the kind of, you know, there were people snooping around. But I mean, that happens anywhere. I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, I don't think, I mean, knowledge is key, right? I mean, to sort of, you know, make it clear, in 1999 in Britain, we produced 300 graduates in Chinese studies in the UK, when the UK had a bigger economy than China. I think it was 2 times bigger than the economy of China. Now China's economy is 3 times the size of ours. How many people did we produce in China studies in the UK last year? 265, less. So I don't know. I mean, we can kind of bang on about China being this and that. We have been so lazy at producing people who can speak Chinese, who can, you know, engage with China and understand China. And I think without that knowledge, it's very hard to sort of, you know, kind of really do this properly. Knowledge is absolutely key, and we don't have much time to build that knowledge up. We might not have enough time, actually. You know, it's going to be a huge pressure, but knowledge is the key thing.
Right, so I'm just going to pick up now on our next topic, which is about China's involvement in critical infrastructure. So that they've sort of, with this Belt and Road idea, seem to be getting involved in a lot of critical infrastructure across the whole world, including in Britain. Do we trust China with involvement in that kind of thing, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's 5G, whether it's ports, or should we just let it be?
Well, I guess I should start, because we've had this debate so fiercely in Australia, and we had an incident where the Port of Darwin was leased to China by accident. Basically, when the Americans found out, they hit the roof, and subsequently foreign investment rules were tightened a lot in Australia after that. To the point where we now have restrictions on foreign investors buying new housing. We have restrictions on whether they can buy in the energy grid, all sorts of things, even farmland. Now, Chinese investment is actually exaggerated in terms of how much people think Chinese investment exists in Australia compared to what it actually is. And the UK and the US, for example, are much bigger inward investors in Australia than China. But nevertheless, there's huge anxiety in Australia, in the public, about Chinese investment, and the government's very alive to it. Now, as I said, we've already banned Huawei. That's not even a conversation we bother having. I mean, it's as I said before, it's just inexplicable to us why the Brits would proceed with that when you're literally building in risk in your future technologies to a company that, as Alicia said, is obliged to spy on behalf of Beijing if it so asks. But in terms of critical infrastructure, we've really set clear boundaries and rules about what can be invested in. They've actually subsequently tightened even further after the pandemic. So it can be done, should be done. And again, if you don't do it, the public will take you there eventually, one way or the other. And it's far better for the political system to avoid future Brexits, to avoid future Trumps or Trump scenarios, to have the political class alive to it and dealing with it in the best and most holistic way.
I think it's quite interesting because it almost takes us back to the conversation we were having earlier with Kerry about having not focused enough on the threat. And I think the big issue is that Western economies and allies haven't invested enough in their own telecoms markets. And I think that is an issue that we need to focus on. So the sooner the government can diversify the sort of telecoms providers we have available to us, the sooner we can develop our own domestic ones, the less there will have to be a requirement to involve other those high-risk vendors that they don't want to do. So I think that's one of the most important things in terms of the discussion we're having now is how quickly can we bring in new providers, how do we invest in those providers, how do we support those providers, and how do we make sure we get to a place with our allies that we have the sort of providers that we actually want and we need providing our telecom services.
It's interesting. I mean, in 2008, in the economic crisis, and I remember there was a big debate in the UK about the sort of appearance of Chinese investment. I think 3% of Barclays Bank was bought by China Development Bank. And in fact, at that time, it was a sort of big thing. London and elsewhere in Britain, really wanted more Chinese investment because of the economic problems. And yet China was very, very cautious and didn't actually invest in anywhere near what people were expecting. And I remember at the time, this sort of discussion that it's okay for Chinese sort of companies to come here because as long as they observe, local rules and sort of regulations, that's fine. And we were really confident in the rules and regulations and the legal system here being strong enough. And it's sort of changed now. There's this sense of vulnerability. And I'm quite interested in that because, the assumption really was that, our kind of legal system is very strong and we're able to kind of, deal with these issues. We've got investment from many, many different kinds of countries, many different kinds of partners. And yet now there's a sort of sense that we're not quite as confident as we were. And that, China, with relatively small amounts of investment at the moment, is going to sort of really, really be a bigger threat than I think we saw, 13 years ago, 14 years ago. On one issue, just the sort of high-speed trains, for instance. Yes, China has built 22,000 kilometers of high-speed trains in the last 10 years. So, there's one interesting thing about, well, does it have significantly better technology? What could it give to the UK? And actually, its technology is similar to other builders of high-speed trains. Its management is problematic for sure. And it's not significantly cheap. Almost all of the high-speed deals done in the Melton Road region, for instance, have been political deals. So I think that's something to sort of think about, that, the Melton Road is really a political economic area. It's economics led by political kind of, I wouldn't say political allegiance, but, there is sort of political sympathy. I think that's what China's looking for, political sympathy. And I guess the final thing, I don't see China really as this. I mean, it's a problem, but we've got to be careful what kind of a problem it is. As I said earlier, it's not a proselytizer. It's not, I think, using these investments for particularly kind of, making us like it. No, not at all. It does, kind of want access to particular technology, but then everyone is kind of finding out about other people's technology. We know that. And I mean, maybe the biggest problem is that China is not an experienced investor in these areas. It's not that it is malign, it's that it's not experienced. That's a different kind of problem.
I would disagree strongly with that, Seena. I think I'll give you some examples. So in Australia, as I discussed, we banned Huawei from the NBN, our national broadband network. So it's a wholly government-owned piece of infrastructure. And China came along and wanted to create PNG, Papua New Guinea, our neighbours, fibre backhaul, give them free Huawei broadband, and it would connect to Sydney. Of course, that was a backdoor into our own national broadband network. They built ports for Vanuatu. That, guess what? They could come along and park Chinese Navy ships there. These are not benign interests. These are very strategic, sharp interests. and China will try and move in wherever it can. So Africa, I think, is of strategic influence for the UK. The Pacific is of strategic interest for Australia. And you've got to be alive to it. You've got to be alive to the risks. And you've also got to understand that Xi Jinping stood by Barack Obama and said he wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. Look where we are 5 years later. You've got to look at China's words and their actions. And if anything should demonstrate China's intent to you, it's the aggressiveness with which they have responded to this pandemic. Suggestions that the coronavirus began in Wuhan upset them, and other calls of censorship. Australia asks for an inquiry into the pandemic. They cut off our beef and barley. I mean, these are not innocent, friendly actions of your trading partner. They are malign actions, and you've got to be careful and guarded and proceed with caution.
I think there's nothing naive or young about their foreign policy strategy. It is very well determined, very strategic, very structured, and it's about recognizing the weaknesses of others and the opportunities they want to gather. And they are very proactive and very strategic in how they do it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be buying up cobalt mines in places in Africa, promising to build the hospitals. And then what they do is they build the facade of the hospital, but there's no electricity points. The hospital's essentially not usable. But when the paperwork was signed by the local government, they thought they were going to end up with a fully operational hospital and roads that work to get people to and from that hospital. And they're left with a shell where they end up with nothing for their communities, and they've given away their cobalt mines, which would have been a source of wealth for them. This is not naivety. This is strategic.
Professor Brown, did you want to come back on that at all?
Well, yeah, I mean, I obviously think it's slightly more complicated. I mean, I think, you know, the Huawei is a very specific issue. And I guess it's really, when you think of China's enormous domestic challenges, it is in its interests, and I think it knows it's in its interests to, you know, kind of have a collaborative relationship with the world. I mean, that's kind of what it's been trying for 40 years. And it has many things that it is not able to do on its own. You know, I mean, I think that's the sort of situation. We're in a similar kind of, you know, boat, really. We're reliant on each other. So, I mean, for sure, it has an intention, but I don't think it's sort of, you know, I mean, and it has a sort of self-interested intention. Yes, for sure. If you say that's malign, okay. I mean, because it's got the political system it's got, that's a malign intention, for sure. I don't think that is. I think that is because it is, you know, kind of self-interested, and it is sort of almost sociopathological in the way that it does diplomacy, yes. But malign, I think, is too strong. I don't think it's got a malign intent, because I don't think it's, you know, what I mean, people in the sort of chat comment are making these charming comments about it wants us to be on our knees and, you know, slaves to China. I think that that's just not true. It doesn't want that kind of responsibility. It's not a colonizer like that. It's not really got that history. It's, you know, self-interested. That's a different kind of proposition.
But that self-interest hits the road when we get pandemics, doesn't it? I mean, China actively punished doctors who tried to tell it what was happening. That sickness has infected the world. That has crashed our economies. That is going to lead to so much economic pain, so much mental stress for people, and all because China didn't want to get on top of that. So yes, China can act in its self-interest, but what China does affects us all. And this is the point of this conversation. We've got to proceed, of course, with relationships with China. Nobody is suggesting we can have a world where China is not the big player. It absolutely is. But it's how we strategically manage ourselves so that when these things happen, we've got the ability to stand up for our own interests, the health of our people and the health of our global economy.
Thank you. And I guess you quite rightly picked up, there is that, you know, within the chat, there is a lot of concern over China's policy and their strategy as well. What I'd be really interested to know is, do you think that this pandemic is it's highlighted all the sort of worries and concerns that we have around China, and also reiterated how important it is to be able to be self-dependent on a lot of things, for example, producing PPE when we need to and ramping that manufacturing up, whether it's food, and other essential supplies. Do you think that this pandemic has sort of marked a change in our domestic policy about being more dependent and buying British and buying British agri-produce or you know, British manufactured products, and whether it's cars, whether it's clothes. Has there been a change, and will that change continue?
I personally think it's quite a difficult one, because it's not feasible for every country to produce everything they need. The UK is never going to be a PPE mass producing country. It's just not what we do. But it's about making sure you have multiple different points where you can go to. And as Latika was talking about earlier, it's about China having cornered certain bits of the market, and the international community got going with that, because it wasn't necessarily seen as a priority, or as it wasn't considered part of the national security kind of bit. I mean, in the UK, we actually have more PPE than many countries because of Brexit, no deal Brexit. We had shored up lots of supplies. But I think it's a very difficult one, because we can't ever get to a position where we produce everything ourselves. It's just not going to happen, particularly with British weather. We're not going to be able to grow everything. We're no Australia. Although I would say that Rutland's been the sunniest place in the country for the last month, which has been quite enjoyable. But ultimately, it's about being smart and recognising that if we have those alliances, which is one of our key differentiators from China, we have incredible alliances, we work with our partners, then we move into a smarter economic system. And that's actually why the UK free trade agreement with America is so important. And that's why our trade agreements with Asian partners are so important. Because if we can do good deals with these key partners, we can bring China more into being a fair market economy partner. It's about creating a system in which they need to operate on a more fair playing field. And we can only do that if we form smart trading agreements and partnerships. But yes, I want to see more buying British, you know, all the way down to kind of supporting our local farmers, all the way through to manufacturing the things we really need in this country, particularly our kind of diversifying our critical national infrastructure. But it isn't feasible to suggest that you can ever be an island on your own.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the future model isn't a case where we all take back and reclaim the manufacturing we outsourced to China over the last few decades. That's not feasible. I mean, we kind of touched on it before about where we can go ahead together. But in the short term, on things like PPE, I mean, we're already seeing local production of that come home. So to an extent, yes, I think the answer to the pandemic is that manufacturing is coming home to a degree. In the US, 7 states have already joined together to form a PPE buying bloc so that they never have to compete against each other in the US in trying to source PPE. And Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, who's set this bloc up with the neighbouring states, he has said the first priority we're going to have is try and make this stuff here. Why are we even needing to buy this from Vietnam or China or wherever? And they've had huge problems with orders not being fulfilled. And then, of course, China seizing the global supply of PPE and farming that out in donations to whichever country it decided it wanted to look benevolent to that particular day. So yes, I do think some manufacturing is coming home, but Australia is actually the most reliant out of the Five Eyes on China for imports. So the Henry Jackson Society put out a very good report yesterday showing our dependence on China for net imports. And some of this stuff is really esoteric, you know, it's ingredients in essential medicines. So everybody has to tread very carefully here, because nobody wants China to cut those supply lines off from them. But we do need to sit down and think very hard about where we go, because as I said, the people will expect this of the government. The people will not be forgiving of a government that leaves them shortchanged in the future and incapable of getting the things they need to survive.
And I guess that's a really, really important point to make, is especially as we leave the EU, we have to learn to maintain relationships, strengthen relationships across the whole world, and that China plays a part in that, very much so. And sort of going back to that point that we made about striking the right balance between economic partnership and being able to hold China to account, what I'd really like to bring in is the Hong Kong issue. So, I mean, just for our listeners that perhaps may not be aware of what's happened in Hong Kong, we saw a spate of quite violent at times protests, and this was quite widely reported in British media until the coronavirus pandemic hit us, and it seems to have gone very silent. And this is all to do with a bill being brought in Hong Kong that would have enabled extradition to mainland China of prisoners, and also has brought up the agreement that Britain had to protect those citizens in Hong Kong and maintain that one country, two systems procedure there. I'd invite Professor Brown just to expand on that some more and just explain perhaps from his understanding what is going on in Hong Kong now. Has anything changed, and you know, what should we be doing?
Well, I mean, so Hong Kong was handed back to the Chinese in 1997, so we're deep into the sort of reversion period, and I think under the kind of agreement we produced sort of these biennial reports in Parliament for 50 years, so you know that's going to be 2047. But I mean, our influence in Hong Kong is increasingly, you know, kind of declined, and just that's because history has been going on. And I suppose you know, the kind of what we've seen really is a Hong Kong that's become very, very divided. It's also a Hong Kong that has been, I guess, sort of has its identity eroded by the fact that, you know, kind of the sort of People's Republic is very, very sort of dominant there now. What can the UK do? That's a really difficult question. I mean, it can certainly work with its other partners, you know, kind of across the world, to say that it feels that rule of law and, you know, kind of freedom of speech and these things should be maintained in Hong Kong. The political situation, though, is really complicated because, you know, in 2014, the sort of change to the election, you know, the election for the chief executive, it wasn't passed by the Legislative Council. It wasn't the thing, you know, that Beijing kind of particularly manufactured. It just wasn't passed by the local Legislative Council, the local parliament. So, in a sense, everything has accumulated since then. The extradition law, though, was a huge misstep by the Carrie Lam administration. So, you know, that's sort of, you could say that that's really that's a Hong Kong homegrown problem.
I think the issue is that the shift we're seeing from the Chinese specifically on this, specifically around the joint declaration. You know, the joint declaration is a legally binding treaty registered with the UN, and yet we have seen the Chinese government come out and say that it's now history, that Hong Kong is purely China's internal affairs. And this is a shift because in the past they were more sensitive about how they worded things, and it doesn't mean necessarily there was a different mindset there, but publicly the way they talked about Hong Kong, they were very careful to walk that line of seeming to respect the joint declaration. So I am very concerned by the fact we seem to see this eroding, most definitely in public, because I think once you move to a public posture of being happy to erode and essentially cast aside a document that importance, that should give real rise for concern. And my predecessor, Sir Alan Duncan, was the Minister for Asia, and he was very clear that this is not a historic document and the declaration must be upheld. And for me, I think it's a human rights issue. It's an issue of self-determination, and it shows a tendency by China publicly and overtly now to rubbish international rules it doesn't agree with. And I think I agree there have been some real missteps, particularly recently. I mean, 19th of April, we saw 15 people arrested. There are claims of torture. It's an incredibly difficult one, and I'm not an expert in Hong Kong in any sense or form, but I am deeply concerned by the shift to the public posture, because that says a lot about what is going on within China currently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, Seena, in Hong Kong either, but I would say that I think one of the after effects of this pandemic will be how China behaves. Because China is, I think, exhibiting some rather bizarre behaviour at the moment, the way it's completely shifted its bullying mode operandi to go public and really be quite aggressive with people in public, which is behaviour it's conducted for the last however long behind closed doors. To take that public is very strange. It's counterproductive. It doesn't work for them. And if anything, is turning more people against China at a time when they need support. And so who is likely to be the victim of a panicked China or a worried China or a China that needs to prove itself again? It's going to be Taiwan, it's going to be Hong Kong, it's going to be Vietnam. So I think it's a really critical danger point, a pressure point. And what the West does, of course, will be crucial, but I'm not really sure that there's any appetite to change, to respond to this should it become a sharper point of conflict than it already is.
I think Latika's completely correct in terms of who will suffer, because it all comes back again to China and the CCP's priorities, which is how they are seen internally within China, the control they have internally, and then potentially reflexively feeling the need to flex that power and strength. But I think the challenge to us in the UK is how we respond, because what we don't need to see is an absolute kind of calling out of of China. China is bad, China are awful, China have done this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. We have to be very clear-eyed and we have to be pragmatic about it. And so that is going to be the real challenge, is how we don't go too far on the meter. We have to call them out, we have to challenge, we have to do an investigation to what happened with COVID-19. And my heart breaks that there's been another outbreak in Wuhan, and that people continue to suffer. But the fact is, we have to be careful as well. And it can't just be down to China in terms of how they behave. We also have to watch ourselves and work out what our response is and what would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think that that's really key. The key here is not to just vent, but to be constructive about how we do progress forward. And there's a tiny bit of that can happen in Australia. There's a certain wing of the politics that will just want to vent on China and jump on China. Well, that's not going to get anyone anywhere. What we actually need to do is have sensible conversations about where we work with China, in areas that are of mutual interest with China, where we accept that we cannot and should not deal with China, and then collaborate together.
Yeah, I mean, that's all very, very good. I mean, that's correct. I mean, I have noticed, in the UK, even in just a few years, that the issue of China has become quite quickly very, very politicized. And when it's good that people are paying attention to China, as I say, it's good that people are stirred out of their complacency. But I think the politicization of this issue is not going to be great, because there's certain sort of things we have to pragmatically accept. There's certain knowledge that we have to have. There's things that we need to sort of understand about China, that China has the right to sort of define itself. And there's certain sort of kind of stories we tell about China to ourselves, which probably are quite old-fashioned. I mean, just I think there's a responsibility that we do have. And I mean, I just find, just anecdotally, a few years ago, I would be saying these sorts of things, about China, and it wouldn't be an issue. And now I find, in just describing, I'm trying to understand and describe China. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just trying to understand and describe it. That's my job. And I find, this sort of wave of, kind of condemnation. And so I find that a pity. I don't think we need that. We had that about Europe. And, I feel like with China, we should learn, okay, that divisiveness is not going to help us. We need a consensus. We really do need a consensus.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of we can't. It's about learning. For example, we've set up something called the Conservative Chinese Research Group, and lots of people have immediately labelled that as an anti-China group. It's not. It's about recognising that we do not have the fundamental understanding of China as a country. The average citizen in the UK, despite handling probably tens of goods every single day in your house that was made in China, have no concept. Wuhan they'd never heard of. They'd never heard of the Uyghur. They couldn't tell you who the president of China is. They couldn't tell you that China calls itself a socialist state and not a communist state. The basic understanding of how a Chinese political system works and what the internal drivers are. We have to fundamentally rechange how we talk about China. But at the same time, I will unapologetically call out when I believe they're doing things like ethnic cleansing of the Uyghur. And I think that's one of the challenges I'm facing as a politician, is people are saying, well, you're saying we have to understand China more, but then you're really going for them on the Uyghur. And my position is very clear. I need to learn lots more about China. We all do. But where I see ethnic cleansing going on, I will speak out against it, and I will do so unapologetically.
I think complexity is the key when you talk about China. And I think that's what in Australia we've tried to do over the last few years, is put together a much more holistic view about China, so that it's not just about the trade. It's not just about security. It is about the people. And I agree with Professor Brown's comments before about Chinese students feeling very segregated on campus. I think that is a big issue. And until this pandemic, there's really not been a lot of criticism or racism directed towards Chinese people in Australia. They've been by and large very well accepted and integrated into the Australian community. One of the great awful things, the great challenges of this pandemic is that it is opening up, I think, racism towards Chinese people, that people in Australia are being the targets of. And that is something we should all be on our guard toward, because that has been a great thing in Australia until now, that we've been able to separate how we deal with the Chinese Communist Party, exactly. And on the other hand, welcome Chinese people into our community.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point. I think in a world that can feel so divided, quite often, it's really important to remember we are all just human beings at the end of the day, and actually, you know, then there needs to be that respect and tolerance for individuals in society, whether they were born in the country we live in or not, you know. I'm just going to go to some questions that we've received from some of our listeners. So I've got a question here from Hercules. What do you think about the Hong Kong factor in the UK-China relations? Do you think Britain should fulfil his promise under the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984?
Well, I mean, that's a legal obligation. I mean, as I think Alicia said earlier, it's a sort of treaty obligation, so we'll have to.
Okay.
I agree.
I mean, but I mean, it depends on how you kind of fulfill it. But yeah. I mean, you know, it's not something you can walk away from. And I think on the whole, the UK has tried to fulfill it. I mean, I think we have to recognise it's not been easy, you know. So it's. I think people have acted with good intention and good intent.
And we have responsibilities, and responsibilities are not always easy. But you have to try and uphold them as best you can.
Yeah.
And we've got another one here from Corey Lang. What do you think Trump's rhetoric will, I think that's supposed to, how do you think Trump's rhetoric will affect the UK relationship with China? I assume they mean with China. I assume they don't mean with the US.
Who wants to start?
Let's talk about Brexit.
I think from my perspective as a politician, I would very much want to put President Trump's rhetoric around China to one side. What the US does is not what the UK does. It is a very important relationship, but it is not a symbiotic one. I remember in my second month, I think, as an MP, the Labour Party demanding that the Conservative Party explain why Trump had made a certain decision. And I remember shouting across the chamber that I think you'll find we don't hold, it's not us who pull Trump's strings, and it is not for the UK government to answer for the US's actions. We are a sovereign state who make our own decisions. I feel particularly as an individual separated from the US government at the moment. Trump is not someone whose rhetoric or foreign policy decisions I see myself wanting to pursue or engage with particularly. I don't think it's had that great of an impact on us because ultimately China and America have a very different relationship from the UK and China, and they do not have the same level of integration of communities, I think, in the same way as we do, and definitely not as long a lasting a relationship. So I think on this one, it is very much the case where Trump can have his rhetoric and his relationship with China, and the UK can exercise and practice a very separate relationship. And I think it's important that people recognise that although we work closely with America, it is not always aligned on all issues.
It's not. I mean, it's a really difficult one, though, isn't it? I mean, I think that's right, but you know, in the kind of we're in a similar position to many other countries that our principal security partnership is with you know, kind of America. And yet, you know, China's a very important economic partnership. I mean, certainly for Australia. For the UK, we're sort of contemplating going along that road, really. I mean, that's one of the options, I guess, that we'll get, you know, more economically close to China. I mean, it's one of the options. And I suppose that sort of security balance is going to be pretty sharp. No one's really solved it yet. That, you know, for the first time in modern history, really, you know, you've got sort of this massive disjunct between your security partnership and your economic partnership, but of course they're very integrated. And I mean, like with Huawei, you know, rhetorically we can say we will do things with Huawei, but actually, if America came and said no, you can't, you know, you couldn't walk away from them. So it's a really tough one. It's a really, really tough one.
I think Trump was the first leader, you know, to come to power, I think, rightly calling out the discrepancies of allowing China into the multilateral organizations, which China doesn't play with on an equal level playing field, right? So Trump is absolutely the oracle in many ways when it comes to determining how politics would be disrupted by China. and if we let the system continue as is, how damaging that would be to the populace. But I think the Trump administration comes with enormous limitations in its ability to influence like-minded countries along its way. And we've seen that with Huawei. I think that if the Trump administration had not been so heavy-handed with the UK and its threats, perhaps the UK may have been in a position to not look like to its public that it was simply following Trump's wishes. I think that that is a real problem in the UK. In Australia, we have a very different way of looking at Trump. It's not that he is loved in any way, but we have a very pragmatic relationship between the government. We don't have this spectacle of the Conservative leader, Scott Morrison, there being asked to explain Donald Trump's actions or being asked to explain something that Trump has said as though Scott Morrison is also responsible. That doesn't happen. Australians are much more pragmatic about that. Having said that, some polling just came out yesterday showing that Australians trust Xi more than they trust Trump. And in the last 2 weeks in Australia, we've had an incident where Australia was very angered because the US have been running around saying that the virus began in a lab in Wuhan. Now, it may very well have been created in a lab. We don't know is the answer because China won't let us in to investigate how the virus began. But it's a big step from that to what the Americans are saying, or have been saying, Mike Pompeo specifically, that there is enormous evidence that this virus did start in the lab and, hey, we've got it, but we're not showing anybody. Then in our media, they went and, the US Embassy is blamed for leaking a so-called dossier, which was basically just a rip and read of published news articles trying to say that this theory was valid. Now, that caused a huge argument between Australia and the US. And one of our MPs, who's considered to be very close to the US on all of these matters and very hawkish on China, actually blasted the US and said, please do not do this. It's undermining our case for an inquiry into the WHO, into how this inquiry began. Let's stick with the evidence that we've got and let that show us the way. So I do think the Trump administration brings with it huge limitations on what it can achieve, which is ironic because it was the first to rightly identify the problems.
Brilliant, thank you everybody. It's more of a comment, I would say, from Ange Chadha. If we collectively do not make an effort to understand Chinese history, understand the history of colonialism, and make an effort to learn Mandarin, we will always be talking superficially about China. Do we all have a responsibility to learn more about China, learn Mandarin, learn more about their culture?
I mean, I think we've all three of us said yes to that this evening. I mean, I spent 3 months trying to learn Mandarin. It just wasn't my skill set. My son's nickname is Monkey in Chinese, which I won't pronounce over the camera because I think that's unnecessary. But I think it's quite a difficult argument sometimes when people suggest that because you're not a fluent Mandarin speaker or because you haven't spent months of your life living in China, you therefore don't legitimately have the right to have an opinion on China's behaviour. And that's a very difficult one for me because it's just not the right approach. That's like saying you can't show empathy for someone or understand someone else's situation because you haven't lived it yourself. Naturally, when you live something, you bring a different dimension of understanding. But I know people who have spent years of their lives in China, speak fluent Mandarin, who are incredibly critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's the other really important angle here is my issue when I talk about behaviours by the Chinese government is the Chinese Communist Party. It is not the average Chinese person on the street or the communities who I believe the vast majority of Chinese people have no idea some of the actions and activities taking place in China against other individuals. So I think, yes, absolutely, we need to learn, we need to understand. That's why the China Research Group has been set up. But you don't necessarily need to be fluent in Mandarin to necessarily be able to understand or engage in a discussion.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think everybody benefits from learning the most about every other country they can, of course. But I'll make 2 points. One, I think the West is pretty woeful in terms of soft power and understanding Asia generally. Even in Australia, there's not that much Asia literacy. You know, why it was such a big deal when we had a Prime Minister who could actually speak Mandarin in 2007. And also, I think it demonstrates to a degree the limitations of Chinese soft power. There's not a lot of effective soft power that the Chinese government carries out. It's very good on coercion. It's very good on hard power. It's very good on economic bullying. but it's not so great at the soft power. And that has been actually one of the big mysteries to me during this pandemic. They really don't seem to understand how to translate themselves to the West. So I think it's actually probably a bit two-way the misunderstanding going on here.
Brilliant. I can see there's a comment here. Why haven't we invited a Chinese speaker onto our panel? I did reach out to Conservative Friends of China just for the record, and we didn't get a speaker submitted. So I tried my best.
I was about to say, Kerry, you're a Mandarin speaker.
I'm a Mandarin speaker. Yes, I could
there
do this. Yes. But I mean that sort of issue. I mean, for the first time, I suppose, in modern history, we have to deal with a power that's got a different view of the world, I suppose. And it's not, I don't think it's just about its governance system. It's also about the fact that, you know, China has been marginal to sort of European, I guess, ideas until, you know, really, really recently. And it's a big thing, you know, that, well, our principal partners before, you know, America and Europe, you know, there was a lot more cultural and linguistic commonality. And now, you know, there is this sort of, you know, a fifth of global GDP is China's, you know, and it's a fifth of humanity, and it's sort of, you know, obviously, you know, it's going to be a part of our lives one way or the other, and it's different, you know, it is different. And in modern history, I don't think we've had to sort of, you know, ever think about, you know, a kind of power so important in our lives, which is different. So, you know, all this kind of idea that, you know, we are going to sort of be able to carry on in a world where China doesn't have some impact, positive or negative. I mean, it's really untenable. And I think it is, as I think Alicia said, you know, it's not about, you know, having some deep understanding, but I suppose it's a recognition that we do need to know some things, and we need to grant China some kind of space in our lives. And I think that's just important, you know, a kind of maybe not what we know, but what we don't know.
Absolutely, and you know, I'm just aware that sort of time is running out. I just want to give you all an opportunity just to conclude your thoughts. You know, from my point of view, there are some real clear themes coming through from our discussions. It is that we need to take more time to really understand the Chinese, or the CCP, particularly China as a state, and where they're going, but also to take some lessons from what they've been doing, and have a much more strategic approach domestically as well. And also sounds like there's no escaping that we must have a relationship with China, whether it's trade, whether it's political, but equally we need to strike a better balance between holding them to account and what we have been doing so far. I invite you all one by one just to provide some closing remarks, and can we start with you, Latika?
Oh, I'm on the spot now.
I
feel like we've said it all, haven't we?
I've been trying to be fair.
I guess I could just go back to my starting comments, which are that the UK is actually in a really prime position because you sit between us and the United States. You are going into something with China with your eyes wide open, which is not necessarily what many other countries could say. And you do have a real chance to approach China a much more holistic way from the outset, which is something we've learned to do over the last 5 years. But the things I would stress are that I think bipartisanship is a huge component to making this work successfully. I think you always have to be on your guard to how the Chinese operate. It's not the way that we operate, and you've got to be on the lookout for it. And that doesn't mean you need to be seeing reds under the bed or paranoid or racist or anything like that. It just means we need to be smarter about this new future we're in.
Thank you. Professor Brown, if I could ask you to step.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, thanks for inviting me on this. And I suppose there's, I think it's a Confucian, one of the sort of classic texts about, you know, the Datong, the great learning. So I guess we're in a sort of period of the great learning. I mean, it's a tough time. It's a really, really tough time. And I do know there's a lot of emotion and, you know, a lot of kind of, I suppose, yeah, a lot of anger and a lot of kind of confusion. But I mean, there's also a sort of lot of opportunity to kind of rethink maybe some fundamental things. And as I say, you know, we have to recognize some facts that, you know, China is a fifth of humanity. It's a fifth of global GDP. It's a fact that we have to deal with and we can't turn away from. I just, a final thing I say is a personal thing that, you know, to me, having lived there for, you know, six years, gone there over 100 times, you know, made it part of my life. I think to me, as you know, a very British person, I have always felt it was my second home. And I mean, you know, I feel that Chinese people have always, you know, kind of mattered a great deal to me. And I think I need, you know, I think that is a really, really important thing to say, that it is not so terrifying. It's not so terrifying. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alicia?
So I think I'd start by saying, I think it's almost what I said at the start in terms of, you know, we need a pragmatic and clear-eyed relationship with China. You know, we can't be dove-like, but we can't be overly hawkish. I think Professor Brown's absolutely right that we need to celebrate the beauty of China and the culture and the literature and the food. I mean, probably one of my favourite restaurants in the world is in Camberwell, and I won't name it because when I started going about 10 years ago, we were the only British, the white British people in the room, and then now you go and you can barely get a seat and everyone looks like a hipster. But we should celebrate what we love about China. But it is also a balance piece, and it's a two-way. You know, it's not just about what should Britain be doing about China and what are the requirements on us and what aren't we doing and what are we doing. It is a two-way street. China needs to redress on the ways it works with us. We need to look more smartly about how we engage and make sure we're doing things in the most productive way possible. We cannot slip into permanent hostilities. I think that would be a very bad situation, not just for the UK and China, but actually for our alliances, our partners, and so on and so on. But ultimately, as an individual, I also know that as a parliamentarian, I have a duty to give my voice to those who are having their voices silenced. And that's something that I know the Chinese government doesn't necessarily want to see or hear. So there's a real balance to be struck. We have a long way to go. We all have a lot to learn. But ultimately, I think success, if there is such a thing, and having worked in diplomacy, there isn't ever a successful outcome in diplomacy, really. Success would be a productive trading relationship, a relationship where we can hold our partners to account and challenge them to be better, both ways, and where absolutely we don't slip into the state of permanent hostilities.
Brilliant. Thank you, all three of you, for your contributions this evening. It's very much appreciated. And thank you for everybody that's listened this evening and participated in the chat and asked some questions. Thank you.